order.
Here we can.
Oh, the no homework thing.
No
We'll
homework
call to
thing.
order
Wait,
the
you wanna
meeting,
just text me that?
the, I don't know, November
Whatever your
21st,
temp
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah.
2022
I'll
meeting
scroll
of the Westford School Committee. Welcome, everybody. How's it going?
Hello.
All right.
It
It is cold. I'm not having that, okay? We will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next item on the agenda is our consent agenda. Everything in that is in the packet, so we should have all had a chance to take a look at that. Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. Any comments or discussion on the consent agenda? Gloria?
Just a super quick comment that I always love to see the new clubs that are coming through, and thank you to all the staff who run them to give our students just such a variety of things to do beyond the classroom.
It's really fun to look at those and see what's happening and all the new ones. Thank you. Seeing no other comments or question, I'll call for the vote. All in favor of approving the consent agenda?
Aye.
Okay, that's 6-0. Thank you. That brings us to public comment. Pretty sure we don't have any public comment here in the room.
Yeah.
Folks who are on Zoom, if you'd like to make public comment at this meeting or any meeting, raise your hand and then we can pull you into the meeting and give you a chance to speak. If you're watching on YouTube and kicking yourself that you wanted to make public comment, you can always check our agendas for the Zoom link, and that's where you'll find the ability to do public comment. Or come join us here at Millennium School in person. I don't see anything for public comment on Zoom, so why don't we move on to informational updates? And we'll start with the superintendent update.
Thank you. Well, I guess the first thing I'd like to just talk about briefly is we are in the midst of parent-teacher conferences today and tomorrow morning, and we did get a couple of questions, and I know the principals have had some questions from families about the fact that they were scheduled as 10-minute conferences instead of 15-minute conferences is what the elementary schools have had in the past. The middle schools have had 10-minute conferences for a number of years now, but the elementary schools shifted from 15 to 10 minutes, and that was something that that was discussed when we were preparing for this year. It was a request by the teachers because we added the school day today, and normally it was not a school day, and so that was one of the things that just while we were changing that this year, going into the unknown, the teachers had just requested that we make the conferences from 15 to 10 minutes to create a little bit of air for them. So it's something that we'll reflect on, we'll be looking at as we prepare for the future as well too. But I thought it would be helpful for people to know that it was something that we looked at specifically for this year because of the change of having a school day connected with the conferences, just in terms of if people had feedback or thoughts about that. I just wanted to share that aspect of that. Another interesting question that had come up from some of the school committee members, and I was like, ooh, I'll actually address this evening, is that there has been a change in the MGL laws around some of school discipline procedures with suspension, specifically under the auspices of 37H, 37H and a half, 37H and 3/4, which is always just wonderfully confusing, all of those numbers together. That is something that all of our administrators, we had already been looking at. We were aware that it was coming, and then when we've actually been, that we had opportunities with some of our school council provided workshops for us back before even November 9th is when that MGL change came into effect. And so you will see some of those changes in the handbooks that will be coming as we move forward. But a number of those things were already addressed with the administrators, and so that was a question that had come up, is when people heard that these changes had been made, they were just curious as to whether or not it had impacted some of our procedures as well.
Can I ask just on that, Dr. Chu, do you think that we need to explore maybe some funding opportunities, and I look to Valerie for ARPA, just in terms of kind of some of the strategies that they're suggesting in this new MGL, be like the collaborative problem solving, the restorative practices, and do we need to plan for additional professional development across the district? Because I know the restorative, we kind of talked about it more on a high school level, but clearly that this is now come into effect from November 8th for K right through to 12.
Yeah, I would
So-
say that as far as the changes with the laws are concerned, we are prepared to be able to address that as we are. However, your question, I think, is great. There are additional things that they reference that schools could be utilizing that I think we should continue to explore. So I think that's where we could be looking to see, okay, well, is there additional, whether it's ARPA funds, whether it's other things that we look at to find out, are there strategies that we don't currently have access to that we could also use that they're suggesting? The different alternatives to suspension that they talk about in the MGL, we are able to meet those requirements. They have like I hesitate to say laundry list, but they have a bunch of suggestions that would work. We haven't implemented all of them, but we've implemented some of them. And so I feel like, so that in the regard of us being prepared for November 9th, we're prepared for November 9th. And we were able to make the adjustments that we need to make. Your question about, are there other things that we can be doing? Yes, I think there are things that we can be exploring as well.
I don't necessarily think it's about, are there other things? I do wonder of the nature of the things we're already doing, the restorative, the collaborative problem
Right.
solving, to really embed it throughout the district. Because, from feedback, I'm aware that it's not happening across the district. So I think it's more of, do we need extra funding and extra PD time to make sure this is embedded throughout the district for all staff, not just, vice principals or principals who typically deal with this. So it was more just to explore what we could do. I know Dr. Ross Green, we had him last
Right.
year, and he's huge, and I know he comes to districts and does training and stuff like that. So I think it might be something worth exploring, of even the practices we have now,
Right.
how to embed them.
And just to that point,
Yeah.
the 37H, 37H and a half, and 37H and 3/4 are only things that the principals and the administrators, those are discipline things that would have elevated to that level.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Your point,
Yeah.
I think, about the idea of just even classroom management, things that are taking place on a daily basis in interactions, that's also different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We had phenomenal professional development with Mirko Chardon.
Yes, he was fabulous. He came last Friday, and it was the first of a 5-series session training for our leadership team. And he co-authored this book, Equity by Design, with Katie Novak, who is a friend of ours, and she's a former assistant superintendent right over in Groton Dunstable, or was. So she now runs her own consulting company, and Mirko is a very dynamic speaker, trainer, presenter, and we thoroughly enjoyed our first 3 hours with him. So the goal here is to help provide support and training to our leadership team when it comes to UDL. You heard Magali talking about it quite a bit, Universal Design for Learning, and implementing that already in its fabric is equity. But now looking at it more explicitly through the lens of equity is something that we want to make sure that district-wide we're all on the same page as we begin the journey for a fuller rollout for a more explicit training on that area. Magali's fabulous in that she has been trained to be a trainer, and she is delivering some of the training here in our district. Pete Meyerson, who is our Abbott School principal, he actually worked as a principal under Katie Novak for many years as well, so was fortunate to have such a direct connection to UDL, and he's one of our experts kind of on the team that will help this rollout move forward. So Mirko was engaging. The feedback that we received is fantastic. He talks about kind of the 4 pillars of equity, and that's equitable access to inclusive classrooms, equitable opportunities to for learning to be parallel with grade level standards, equitable expectations for students, and equitable feelings of belonging and hope. So from a big picture point of view, certainly things that align with the beliefs of the district. One of the biggest focal points for that day was understanding equity versus equality. And while in many cases there's a space for equality, this work is really around equity, and that variability is just the norm and not the exception to the rule. And equity does not mean that everybody's getting the same thing. It means with many different supports and strategies in place, students are given the support that they need to be the best learners that they can be based on the same set of standards across the district. So it was kind of a big picture introductory. It was very motivating, it was inspiring, and we're very excited about the work to come over the next many months. And then following through from the leadership point of view to seeing how it plays out in the classrooms because we've got specific time devoted to that type of rollout and training. So we know that it will take time, but we believe that the pathway that we're on for this rollout is a thorough one so that we can really implement this with fidelity.
Thank you.
Great. Can you just talk briefly a little bit more about the rollout and so what you see happening next?
Sure. So this year right now, Magali is working specifically with the elementary specialists, counselors, PE teachers, art teachers, music teachers, and is kind of doing a general UDL 101. Meanwhile, we have our grades pre-K to 2, or I'm sorry, K to 2 working on the science of reading, and that is through the lens of equity and finding ways, multiple avenues and access points for our students. So UDL is embedded in there. The detailed focus and the topic is science of reading, but we're kind of baking in the framework of UDL into that training. And we're doing the same thing 3 to 5 with math. Then 6 through 12, we're doing performance-based assessments, and the curriculum coordinators are working kind of on the side prior to these PD days with Magali, and as they're coming up with more engaging performance skills-based assessments so students show what they know, there will be the framework of UDL built into that. So it's starting this year. However, moving forward next year, we have 6 through 12 having a much more explicit UDL type of training, even though it's being baked in everything we're doing in the meantime. And the following year after that is elementary for a much more specific UDL type of training, but they're getting all of those foundations with the topics that they're learning about now.
Excellent. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Right?
Sure.
A couple of fun updates just from the schools. The Miller School, along with most of our schools, are actually collecting donations for the Westford Food Pantry. It's something that happens this time of year. It's I think it's a great way for students and families to get involved and to be helpful. When I was at the Miller School a couple of weeks ago, they were rolling it out the morning, I think I shared when Principal Boylan and I were in the kindergarten class watching her video of her morning announcements, if you remember that story. Well, that morning she was talking about the donations, and she challenged them to raise, I believe, 400 items, and they were able to raise 500 items, which means she will be dressing up as a turkey this week at school, which is, I think it's a wonderful incentive. They were very happy about that, to see Principal Boylan. So I think it's an interesting thing. Principal Boylan is dressing up as a turkey. I'm curious as to what the other principals are going to be doing as well. That's sort of a challenge there. Additionally, she wanted to share that recently they had one of their second grade students, along with the school nurse and the student's mother, did a presentation for the student body about juvenile diabetes. And the student was able to kind of share their personal story. And so we're talking about a second grader who's, sharing with the entire school just about, about their experiences. And so I thought that was pretty special to share. And then if you saw my WestfordCAT update last week, you'd know that when we were at Nabnasset last week, I think I had the best question asked so far when I'm visiting schools, which was a kindergartner who, when the kindergarten teacher was trying to explain to the class who I was and what I do, it always leads with, well, he's the guy who decides if we have school or not on a snow day. And innocently, this wonderful student just raised her hand and said, "What's a snow day?" And it led to like a wonderful 15, 20-minute conversation with a kindergarten class who had no reference context as to what a snow day meant. Some of them were like, "Well, that's when it snows." I'm like, "Well, that's true, right?" And so then we had to get into, we might not have school. And then I saw that actually created a sense of concern for some of the students that something could happen. So I had to make sure that we were de-escalating that so that it wasn't, we're not talking about like an emergency, that it's just, it was wonderful. And it just, the whole time the kindergarten teacher was just looking at me and we're like, yep, this
And
is.
didn't you say one student had shared that
Oh,
he hadn't experienced
yeah,
snow yet?
and one of them, there was a student who had actually just moved to our area and had never seen snow. And so that reminded me that we have students in all of our buildings that have joined us from different areas of the world, the country, where those first flakes are pretty exciting. It's just interesting to put that into context. Yeah.
So cute.
And then just the last thing, were you going to talk about the ghostwriter at all? I don't know if that came to you. You might not have known about that.
Their field trip?
When they went to St. Louis?
Yeah.
Were you going to share any of that?
No, we were not.
Then I will go ahead. Well, I didn't want, if you were going to, because you have all these great updates all the time, I didn't want to say that.
Yeah, we have a lot of field trips in general
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
on.
So the ghostwriter went to the National High School Journalism Convention in St. Louis, and 2 of our students were recognized, which I think is awesome. Deepa Gautam earned an honorable mention for her feature writing, and Jack Zwern earned an excellent second place finish for his review writing, which I think is just awesome. I mean, I think
great.
in my tenure so far in this position, I've learned a lot about the ghostwriter, and I just really appreciate the work that they're doing. I find that it's the most reliable reporting that we see most times, and the fact that they're being recognized on the national level is fantastic.
Do we know what Jack reviews?
Nope.
In my head, he reviews school committee meetings, but
Okay.
I'm just,
That's good. We'll go
I'm
with that.
guessing that's not it. I don't think I've read any of his reviews, so that's very cool.
Apparently you're missing out.
Right.
I'm gonna check them out.
That's right.
Actually. Yeah. I was just thinking, I was making my list of, we were talking with friends of like shows and movies that we haven't seen, when you get together and everyone's like, "Oh, have you seen this?" And then I'm like, it's all filling my head, so I'll see what Jack thinks I should
I would
watch,
definitely
and then
think that
we'll-
the ghostwriter, there are definitely things, if you haven't seen it all, you should be paying attention.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. School committee updates. Catherine.
Policy met last week, myself and Gloria, and we had the pleasure of Mr. Chris Sanders attending with us, which was a very nice thing to have you come along and give us bit of company, seeing as it's just us two this year. So we discussed, we had a parent raised concern regarding just some parts of the handbook, which we've passed on to leadership. And the big kind of thing we did along with you, Chris, was look at our policies, reviews, and what's coming up, kind of mapping out the next, not just few weeks, but few months of some of the policies that we know will be updating. And one of which is, which you already spoke to, Dr. Chu, is the new MGL, because obviously we're going to have a look at our own handbooks and policies. And so the next meeting of policies, December 1st. Feel free to come along. Any of you crazy folks hanging out on a Thursday looking for something to do? It's a wild time.
It was a wild time. Thanks for having me. Valerie?
Finance Subcommittee met last week. We approved our goals for the year, which include supporting the budget process. We're going to plan to continue evaluating fees as our bandwidth allows. And also, great segue, we're going to have some policies that we need to review. So I might be a guest on one of your upcoming meetings. We know that procurement one needs to be updated. We know the procurement one needs to be updated, but their MASC sent out a list of some other financial related policies that could be updated as well. In that meeting, we also reviewed parking fees and are investigating eligible ways to use that money. We reviewed bus fees, which we feel comfortable with, and talked about the fuel escalation clause. If you may remember from the spring, that D-Bus has exercised. And we talked about an estimate that Jenny had provided for the fiscal year 23 of what we think that might be, and we're considering what an ARPA request for that might be, like we did in the spring. Which is my next segue into the select board met last week and discussed a last call, if you will, for ARPA requests with a deadline of December 5th. So we don't have a finance subcommittee meeting before then, but I'm working through that process. So if you have any interest or opinions about that, please connect with me.
Do we know how much funds are left or available, or
That's a great question.
It's like 3.5 million.
still?
Yeah.
Oh.
3.5, 3.6, I think, which was like about half of the total, because I think the total was just over 7. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds like a lot to me, but I don't have the number handy.
I know we had a few things put in that kind of didn't get funded or looked at, so do we need to kind of
Yes.
resubmit, or
They're still there.
they're still
They're
there?
still on their list, yep.
Okay,
But we might need to
They took some
underline
things
them.
off that
Yeah.
we then found other funding for.
right.
So they did make those adjustments, but
Yeah.
they kept the other things on the list, yeah.
I'm just curious if we need to kind of flag them again, or I don't know
think
what
we're just
way,
gonna-
select board or,
Chris and I were going to talk about sort of looking at them with a fresh set of eyes.
okay.
But again, if you have, feel free to connect with me if any members have input on that. Also at that meeting, they set the date for town meeting. Annual town meeting is set for Saturday, March 25th at 10 a.m., and we will be back at Westford Academy.
inside, indoors.
Indoors. And I'm also happy to announce that the Access to Town Meeting Committee recommended that childcare be set up, and the select board supported that, and the town manager office will be looking to implement that.
Oh, I volunteered that we would do it. Is that?
No,
No? Okay.
no. Yep, no, so, that's great.
And then also at that meeting, DEI, there was a agenda item where the DEI committee came and presented about Holocaust remembrance. And so the select board actually voted to recognize January 27th as Holocaust Remembrance Day in Westford from here on out, not just this year or next year, and to recognize January as Holocaust Education Month in Westford. And so I know they're really interested in the educational aspect of it, so I'm imagining and hoping that there's some crossover in seeing how we do that, not just how we educate the community, but I mean, I'm sure some of this already comes into the classroom, but if there are opportunities for more classroom education
Okay.
During the month of January, I know they'd be interested in that. And that,
Should they connect with Magali for something like that?
yeah, I think that probably makes the most sense.
Yep. We'll certainly pass that along to
Yeah.
her as well.
Yeah, Joe Diamond is he's sort of been spearheading that, so.
Okay.
That's the person to connect with. And they also adopted a working definition of anti-Semitism for the town, just so everyone has that sort of base understanding. That's all I had from that. Any other committee updates? Okay, great. Student updates. What's going on?
Okay, so tomorrow we have a big, it's a pretty big deal. Tomorrow we have Chris Heron, who is part of the Heron Project. He's coming in to speak to the entire school, and that's the first time in a long time we've had an entire school assembly. So our last block, I believe the seniors and some juniors will be headed to the auditorium, and then other grades will be together but watching from somewhere else. And this is a really important speech because he's talking about, like, I believe it's like making good decisions and talking about how to avoid destructive situations given his past, which is a pretty public past, and so how we can learn from that. And so that's kind of exciting. And then also the following day on Wednesday, Mr. Antonelli has encouraged the teachers to sort of debrief as much as they can with the students, what we learned, what questions we had, and stuff like our thoughts. So it should hopefully be really insightful for a lot of the student body. And also for those who don't know, Chris Heron is a former Celtics player, Massachusetts native. So, and he was quite a figure. Anyways, so we're gonna be having that tomorrow. The Holiday Bazaar is coming up on December 3rd, so very, very soon. For people who don't know, a bunch of clubs, basically anybody who wants to have a table and wants to sell something at this bazaar has the chance to do so. It's super fun. Stuco sets it up the night before. So that is super fun. And then also on the 30th, for students or for parents watching, we have a blood drive. And usually Westford Academy is known for donating a lot of blood, so hopefully we can get a lot of students to sign up for that.
What date is that, Magna?
November 30th. Yeah.
Wednesday.
Yeah. And then also on the note of the food drive, the WA class of 2023 ran a food drive competition between all the classes, and we were able to raise we were able to collect 450 cans. So that was really exciting, and that has been donated to the Westford Food Pantry as well.
Yeah. And then the report cards just recently came out, so it was the first time the report card came out on Power Schools. It's a little bit of a transitionary period for students and teachers are just getting used to kind of the process of uploading to Power Schools and making sure everything goes smoothly. And then Thanksgiving break is also coming up. We have a half day on Wednesday, and Mr. Antonelli has sent out to all the teachers that there's no homework, no tests, and no quizzes on the Monday after the break. And that policy will go for every single long break that we have. And then on the athletics side, the Westford Academy boys and girls cross-country teams competed at the state meet. The Paul Bergeron Jr. came first in the state, and the boys team was second in the state. And then there's also a football game on Thursday at home.
What time's the game on Thursday?
Tests and quizzes.
Yeah.
You guys know what time the game is Thursday? I'm never here.
I
so
think
I'm
it's
never
like
here.
10 a.m. or
Oh.
11 a.m.
10.
Yeah,
It's 10 or 11, yeah,
Some of these
10.
years we're going to be here for. We always travel.
It's against Acton.
Yeah.
And also, I did want to say, I wanted to shout out Mrs. Musto, if any of you guys know her, because this Power School thing, she talks to me sometimes, and it's really not easy, and she's been the point person for all the teachers in the school, so it's definitely been very hard to navigate Power School, so I just wanted to shout her out in a little...
Thanks to Mrs.
Very
Musto
nice.
for all her
Yeah,
efforts.
she really is the reason a lot of teachers have been able to get their grades in. So yeah.
I'm guessing it's just that first year learning.
Yeah.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
everything I can
Yes.
tell, it seemed more intuitive in every way. So I'm guessing like
Yeah.
once we all get used to
we're
it.
up and running.
I can already say I downloaded the PDF of the first quarter, report card, and after years and years of the old system, where the PDF was always rotated 90 degrees, I was so thrilled that it would, like, was upright. I don't know if everybody's ever had the experience. It was always rotated 90 degrees. I'm like,
It's so what?
okay, good job. Oh, good job in your class, huh?
Well, and then also like looking at the comments, like click.
Except you're too lazy to like rotate it before you get to see your grades, so I would just
Yeah.
Well,
do
that's
this because I
exactly.
don't want to rotate it before I get to see my grades.
That's really fun.
It's very funny.
Thank you for the update.
Sorry, did you say one of our own students was first in state?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
Paul
he's
Brown.
he's a state champ.
Fastest in D1 for the state.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Okay, that was a meaty update.
Yes. Yes.
All right, we can move on to business items. First one is the FY24 budget and the budget timeline, and we invite our Finance Director, Jenny Lynn, to join us. Thank you.
So I'm going to briefly talk about fiscal year 24's budget timeline. As we look into fiscal year 24's budget timeline, we are already at the end of November. Since the annual town meeting has been moved from June back to March, as Valerie already mentioned. So our budget timeline has to move almost 3 months ahead this year. So this whole budget schedule is really tighter than last fiscal year. We currently are working on the budget priority development and the ongoing internal budget discussion. Tomorrow morning, Dr. Chu, Dr. Clary, and myself, we will have a meeting with Town Manager Jody to talk about fiscal year 24's budget. The biggest challenge we are facing right now is the estimated 14% increase for special education tuition, for the estimated amount for $519,000. If that becomes the reality, it's going to be significant impact to our general funds operating budget. So that's something we're going to discuss tomorrow morning. On December 5th, Dr. Chu will have the budget presentation to school committee. December 13th, town manager will present the town's budget to select board. January 17 is budget hearing and the school committee vote on fiscal year 24's budget. Then January 19, it will be the first budget hearing with finance committee. Following February 2nd, it's the second budget hearing with finance committee. Then March 25th is our annual town meeting.
So, in her first year, we give her 3 months or
Right.
less time, to prepare all this.
I've got confidence.
Yeah, well, we do too. I
Good
just so far, Dr. Clary even mentioned this morning, just the level of detail that exists. It's like, I felt like we found a lot of clarity last year, which was great, and then to bring Jenny Lynn on and like her experience, just having everything so detailed and specific. It's as difficult as it might be right now, just to kind of go through it in the first time. Like, it's setting us up for really clear understanding when we look back on it to say, oh, that's what that was, that's what this was. So I think that's great. And one of the things she mentioned, we did share with many of you, just the notion of that there was a 14% increase recommended for special education tuition for private schools. So private tuitions for, they can potentially go up to 14%. We're waiting to see if the legislators and the governor agree to do that. It is going to have a massive impact on all of the schools statewide, because it is something that's just that they recommended across the state. And so, we're going to work to see if that comes to fruition. What does that mean? If it doesn't come to fruition, then there'll be an increase of some kind. But we'll look to see how we're able to.
And is my understanding of that, Dr. Chu, that some schools may choose to, if the recommendation passes, some schools may go the full 14% increase, and maybe other schools maybe only choose 5%, or what I'm trying to understand is, so the potential impact is 500 and something thousand, assuming all the schools our students are attending all go up by 14%. But it may not reach that much depending on what each school chooses to do.
Yeah, my understanding is that it's a recommendation
Mm-hmm.
for the governor and for the legislators to approve.
Hmm.
If they approve it, then what you're saying is correct, that it allows people to go up to the 14%, right? So that's kind of what you were just saying, is that
Yeah.
so when you say schools, it's like it's the private school that determines their tuition, so they could choose to go up as high as that amount, or they could do less if in general if it's approved. So I don't know if they're gonna look at it as a tiered process. You know, the rationale that they have for doing that in the first place, you know, they might say that maybe we need to look at that over a couple of years. I don't know. Yeah,
Big jump.
it is a big jump.
Yep.
And related to that, Chris, that would apply to, again, your understanding, and it hasn't passed, right? But that 14% jump would apply to private schools as opposed to things like the collaborative?
Exactly.
Is that right?
Right,
Okay.
so we're a member of the Valley Collaborative, and so it's a collaborative of a number of the school districts in the Merrimack Valley, and that's a different, though that is still basically a public institution, it is supporting directly public institutions, and so that does not qualify for the 14%.
Okay. And is it fair to say that a large chunk of our out-of-district placements are with the Valley?
No, actually, the larger, when we look at that, well, when we look at the potential costs of $519,000, the significant portion of that is if the 14% is realized. I'd have to look to see the percentage. I mean, we do have a number of students who attend Valley Collaborative. I don't know if because the prices are just different, right? So the
Right.
actual tuition costs are different. So I'd have to look to see the number of student comps, whether it was more or not. What I'm thinking of when we look at that, the estimated increase, the larger share of it is the private schools.
So that 519 delta that we're talking about is, the assumption that we're making is if our out-of-district placements stay the same as they are now, we'll have a $519,000 difference, assuming that those particular institutions raise their tuition by 14%?
Yes,
Is that
it
correct?
could be that amount or less.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Other
thank you.
questions?
Any questions?
You're doing great. Your presentations are outstanding. They're so clear. You clearly put a lot of energy and effort into them, and I sincerely appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, our 7:30 agenda item is Strategic District Improvement Plan, recapping the webinar we had on the 9th, your visit to League of Women Voters
Right.
last week, where you got to talk about it a little bit too, and just generally catching up where we're at and where we're headed.
Yeah, so we had, I think it was almost 117 people register for the webinar. We didn't have that many people attend, but we had, I think it was like
We had about
somewhere between 43 to 48.
Yeah.
Yeah, like when at its peak, which I think is great. And we did record it and we have posted it, so people have been able to see that. I was really appreciative. I was very thankful for the three of you, Catherine, Chris, and Carrie, for helping to watch the different questions that were coming in, because I was usually on the other side of that. And so this was the first time that I was just able to kind of think and listen to questions that were being posed to me and go through it. I also shared even a shorter version of that same presentation with the League of Women Voters on the following Wednesday. And again, got some good feedback initially from them as well too. I think, you know, we were able to address a lot of different things that had come up. I'd be curious to know what your perceptions were of the evening. If anybody, especially any of you who've listened to it.
I was at both. It was very, and I know, I'm not sure if Gloria and Chris are, it was just really interesting to kind of be in two different groups and to kind of see what bubbled up or jumped out at for the various people. So it was very interesting from that perspective. And I have to say, I really did enjoy the League of Women Voters, you know, because some of them were, you know, their grandparents or, you know, their kids are long gone. So it was interesting to see their perspective. I think it went well. I mean, I do think that, I mean, clearly families and parents really liked the opportunity to engage in it. I know, I mean, I think to have nearly 50 people attend a webinar was amazing. And I know a number of people who said to me saying, oh, sugar, I had registered, but I can't make it now. So I know there's definitely more people looking to view the webinar. I do think my takeaway from it was that maybe we need to be more explicit in understanding for explaining to people where we are in the process, because I think as we were coming through that webinar, there was questions coming in and was trying to let people understand, well, these are really kind of the topics or those kind of big picture areas that we're looking at, and we just want to get some feedback, ideas, thoughts on these. And once we've kind of solidified that, then we'll go into the more detailed plans that we will hopefully start, you know, come out in January. So I think it's something that maybe we can go, you know, further down the line or whatever, maybe kind of be a bit more explicit and to kind of get that feedback. And I think there's maybe value in doing another one of these, that maybe when we've kind of looking at the plan, because I think there was some really solid, I think, questions that came through across all areas, and all of the people asking the questions. There was a variety of parents and staff and students, and it was really nice to see. So hopefully we did an okay job and we can do it again.
I mean, I had a similar reaction. I thought it was clear that that people were interested. I mean, again, I feel the same way. I mean, we aren't doing as many webinars. I mean, when COVID hit, yes, everything was a webinar, everything was online. So yeah, we were getting hundreds of people, but we haven't done a lot of these. And to get 48 on a Wednesday evening, I thought really indicated people are really curious and engaged. And I thought that, and like you said, a wide cross section. I'm just repeating what you said. What a waste of time. But just to reinforce, but I do think at the beginning people weren't sure where we were in the process, and my hope is by the end people felt a little more comfortable understanding where we were. I think you did a good job of explaining that. But I also think that there is an appetite to be kept up to date on this as it goes. So it'll be interesting as we pick what moments is the right time to say, okay, we're gonna, how do we get this out to the public? You know, when is it appropriate? What's the best way to inform people, or multiple ways to inform people, which we've been doing through the SAC meetings and things like that. But you know, we've offered multiple avenues for people to engage with the process. So
it's a friendly reminder that people don't all chime into this meeting.
Well, exactly. As much as we'd
because
like this
I'm
to
like,
be the
right away when I
one-stop
was
shop,
like,
right.
wait, can somebody explain the feasibility study? I was like, oh, okay, all right, yeah, okay, let's do that. And then the idea of not everybody necessarily knows what an SAC is, right? So like to explain that, those are good reminders.
And then I agree, like in thinking about the priority areas, people saw the topics kind of written out and saying, so what's the answer? So what are you doing for students? And the answer is, that's the beauty of the work ahead of us, is to establish exactly what that is.
And it validated the topic areas, though, I think, too.
It
'cause
does.
I think it was people were interested
People are
in.
genuinely intrigued, and they want that. They nobody seemed to have questions about these objectives, right? They're more like, okay, well, what are the action items going to be?
Right.
Which is good, because we just want to make sure that people are also supportive of these objectives. And that seems to be pretty clear.
I thought it was interesting though as well. I know, because I know we spoke, I got to attend the student advisory council.
Committee.
I get
Committee.
committee on Friday with Gloria and Chris, and it was awesome. Because we got to discuss some of the topics there. And I think what kind of resonated with me, it came up in the kind of family webinar, and it probably came up with the student committee as well, was maybe that we can look at some of the language and maybe rephrasing and redrafting maybe some of the kind of priority areas, just based on, you know, people's thoughts and suggestions. So I really liked the fact, I just found it interesting that the thought had occurred to me during the webinar, but yet to hear the students kind of reiterating the same thought was really interesting to see, and kind of maybe make it more accessible. I think when, as an educator, when you read some of these things, you know what it means, but for, you know, for a lot of our parents, you know, our students, they're not necessarily understanding, and our community members, it was the same, you know, to really understand how we phrase and kind of write the document, I think will be really important to make sure it's SDIP 101 for dummies. And I mean that in a nice way.
Well, I think one theme in the many questions that had come up was related to special education. And while that special education is not a subgroup explicitly outlined or underscored in the priority areas, that's because when we're planning this, it's planning for all students. So every subgroup of students will be accounted for in all of this work, versus here's what the school is doing and here's this separate thing for a certain population of students. So I found that to be so interesting as well, some of the questions.
And I think when you do the plan, Carrie, you know, for somebody in a variety of groups, not necessarily special when we get down to the more nitty-gritty action items, maybe they'll be able to identify and say, oh, I can see how that action item is going to, you know, benefit or really work well for our family or our community. So I keep tuned, stay tuned.
Right.
Just as a side note, I would add that it was great meeting with the student advisory committee on Friday and going over this, and we only got through in an hour. We only got through 2 of the 4 strategic objectives, which tells you how good the conversation was.
Amazing.
We you know.
That's why the principals were doing it for October and November too, knowing that it's like there's
a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
Valerie.
So for all of the sort of interest that has been piqued, can you, and I know we've talked about the timeline back when we talked about goals and back when you gave like kind of the beginning of the school year recap of the summer work. Can you just walk us through what will happen in the winter months? Like what's the next steps?
Right. So, I will say, when we were first talking about the original timeline of the ISDIP, I didn't necessarily know that our budget timeline was going to be as early as, it's only early for us for a couple of weeks, but it's enough to make December and January a little, okay, wait a second, we have to deal with a lot of the budget stuff. So we're collecting feedback from the SACs. I met with the League of Women Voters, and we've been talking about this with our DEI team as well too. My original thought was in December to be gathering kind of that information to try to start to articulate some very clear action items that will go along with these priority areas, if these priority areas were still as supported as they seem to be. I feel like that's going to be, I feel like in January, I anticipate late January bringing maybe the actual plan to the committee. And if not, then in February, so that then it can be approved before. I would like the schools to be able to have something so that they can start transitioning into their school improvement plans for March, so that in March and April, they could be developing their plans to then bring to you in the April timeframe, because we know once we hit May and June, next thing we know, we're looking at the end of the school year. So moving backwards, we need to have the school improvement plans ready to bring to you this spring. So if we have them presenting in the end of April, beginning of May, then I feel like we move backwards from there. So I feel like if I've presented the school, the action plan that goes along with the strategy to you for the end of January, beginning of February, that allows for time for them to still meet. But like I said, they are looking at the priorities right now. So they can be thinking about that, and they know that they should be thinking about that, so that even if for some reason, if something delays us, whether it's budget, whether it's, say, winter, anything.
That's not wood.
I feel like, that would still provide us time, because I do really believe that the end, working backwards by design here, it's to make sure that the school improvement plans are presented to you for approval this spring.
Thanks for that reminder. And all that interest that you guys were talking about with the, what was typed in, people seem to be like thirsty for the action steps.
Yeah.
So when we think about like it presenting to us end of January or beginning of February, we'll probably do what, like our usual 2 meetings schedule, or like, okay,
Yeah.
to
A
give
2
an
meeting.
opportunity for that feedback.
Yes.
Yeah.
definitely.
Okay, great.
And that's a good reminder that
Yeah.
we did collect all those questions and comments from the webinar.
Right.
And we've shared them with the administration and the committee, so we have those, and those can be something we refer back to make sure that we're answering those questions and addressing those concerns.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments from the committee? Okay. Thanks for the update. More to come very soon.
That's right.
Sorry. No,
Right around the corner,
soon. I
really.
don't want to say very soon, but yeah, it'll be soon. And our next item is our school walkthrough recaps. So the committee has been visiting and walking through the schools in the district. We've hit every school but
Oh, no.
one.
NAB
Every
is-
school but one. We have 2 more visits because we're doing a second one to Westford Academy a week from tomorrow, and then 2 weeks from this Thursday on the 8th, we have our rescheduled Nabnasset visit. And those are both full. We have 3 members on each of those. So we just thought it'd be a good opportunity to reflect on both what we've seen, but also how we feel about the format and the logistics of doing this. And are there things that we'd like to try next year? Because this format really is what we started doing last year, and it's been nice. But I think given just how things have gone and the number of schools, and it's an opportunity just to talk about like what we liked and what we might want to do. I know on Friday when we were at Miller, we had some really good conversations about new ideas of different things to do. So it'll be interesting. Yeah, Magna.
Maybe you're about to explain this, but I was wondering what like what do you guys do, or what do you guys look for when you go through a walkthrough? Just because I'm interested to.
Well,
They
I
look
don't-
to see what are you doing.
you just or watching.
I think that's a great point, right? Because I say this, I have a family of, I've come from a family of educators, right? So some of it feels a little staged to me, right? So you're coming, everybody's ready for you, like, they know you're coming, and they're doing, they're doing their very best to like show you what they're working on. And so I agree with you that what we're seeing is what is being presented to us. And so, you just take in as much as that as you can, and then you ask questions.
I've never actually never had that feeling though, that it's because, like, I mean, I think a lot of the elementary classrooms, they're literally doing their like station work, which is like, there's no presentation to that. That's what they do every day at that
I
time.
will tell you as a teacher, when you know you've someone coming, you will make sure you
No,
have planned,
I
you're
agree.
organized, because that's just the teachers.
No, I agree that in
a good
theory
way.
I expect
Yeah.
that, but I'm going to be honest, like on the
That's good
walkthroughs,
work.
like
Yeah.
at WA,
Yeah.
I can't think of a class where I felt like, oh, this is
No.
different than what they'd be
No.
normally doing.
Yeah.
I think it was often we were seeing actually a lot of the routine aspects of like, oh, we do this every day. We
Yeah.
warm up with this 15,
yeah.
5 minutes, and like the foreign language classes.
Oh,
a lot
they
of
were
warm-up
amazing to
things,
see.
Yeah, I don't think that when you went in my past, we've seen you guys, we've changed anything. I more meant like, so we hear these conclusions and takeaways, but I was wondering sort of like what you guys walk through, or what your sort of, what your schedule looks like in terms of how you get these conclusions that you
Yeah.
are about to present to us. Like,
Well-
do you just visit classrooms or? are
Okay,
you
good
given-
question. So to go back a little bit, this is relatively new. Before, we would do building walkthroughs in the summer to look at like,
A Saturday.
yeah, on a Saturday or whatever, to look at like maintenance, like a big project coming
Yeah.
up. We got to replace the windows, So we were never doing it when students were there. And then COVID hit, and then when we were coming back to the classroom, we did a set of walkthroughs before the students were there.
First, you rode the bus.
We rode the bus,
You rode the
to
bus.
look at
and then you
COVID
went
protocols
to
in the bus
see,
in spring.
Like, what were these
seeds.
classrooms going to look like?
And then what are these?
Yeah.
And they were like, boy, it's interesting to see this, but it'd be really good to see it with the students here as well. And so I think the first time we did with students was last fall.
year. So what we did is we have curriculum coordinators throughout the district, and so we asked the curriculum coordinators to sort of establish a schedule so that they could spread themselves out throughout the district and invite and host the school committee members to go and see different things that they want them to see. Back to your point, right? Like, so they're like,
Yeah.
we actually want you to see, this is this thing that we're working on, and we think it would be great for you to see this and
Yeah.
to see this in action. It is interesting because I think, and you two can attest to this, you probably see people all the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And to the point, I think your point about, yes, there's a certain level of when people are invited to come in, are people putting on their best? That's true. But I just know that as a building principal and now as superintendent, most of the times I'm in a classroom, people don't know that I'm in the classroom. I've been in the classroom for 5 to 10 minutes before somebody even knows that I've walked into the room. And that's kind of the typical process, not though when you kind of are an additional,
Well, I said
invitation.
The joke
so
on
it's a
Friday
little
was
different.
at first because I haven't been, I'm not in K-2 schools that or pre-K to 2 schools that often, so it takes me a while to calibrate the ages. Like the first classroom I walked in, I'm like, I don't know what grade this is because it's just I have to calibrate. But then I joked at
They're
the end, the way I can tell I was in a 2nd grade classroom is we'd walk in and some kid would look at me and say, "What are you doing here?" Or, "Who are you?" And
He's the big dog.
Yeah, the first graders weren't comfortable, the kindergartners were not comfortable doing that. The
Every
second
school
graders were
level
like,
has
"Who are you?"
their big dogs.
So yeah, they noticed us a little more. But I think it's a good chance to actually ask committee members what are they looking for, but I think you explained it pretty well. And I think the nice thing is the curriculum coordinators can use the opportunity to be in a classroom to tie sort of these higher level curriculum goals, like here, we're working on this, to things that are actually happening in the classroom. So we see value in that. Like sometimes we can't picture how does a curriculum that we talk about here, on PowerPoint, how does that actually play out in reality? And so it can be really useful for that. But that's just one aspect. There's any number of things that we look for, and I think that's part of what we can talk about is what do we look for and what did we feel like we got out of it this year?
I think sometimes as well, just being in the building sparks questions and conversations that would probably never enter your head in this setting as well. So, and I mean, some of it can be really, small about, what way does the robotics team work? I mean, we saw their little area for testing and stuff on one of the tours, or, the logistics of student movement around the building, but it's that stuff there in the moment that does spark the conversation and questions. So it's kind of nice, and just engaging with the students. I just think it's so nice that we actually do talk about what they're learning, what they're liking. I loved being in with this the 6th graders at Blanchard. So I was asking them, how's it going, moving up to middle school, and it was just lovely to kind of hear them say, oh, it's busy, we've our binder, but they were liking it, and so it was really neat to kind of have that opportunity, mainly to connect with the students and see how they were doing.
I think, just to answer your real question, the one that I didn't answer, I've been in schools like all throughout the Commonwealth, right? I run a program where I get the chance to go to schools all over Massachusetts, and I think that you can tell a lot from just being in the building. I think there's like different, you might call it like the vibe of the building, but like, like there's like an energy in the building, and I think that when I when I walked around Robinson, like what I really looked at was there had been a lot of effort put into like the classrooms and making the spaces like really great for the kids, and I think you can see that, right? Like I think there's like small details and big details that you can tell about like what a building's like what's the philosophy of the building, and like what is important to folks in the building. And I think you can kind of see that just from like walking around and the things that people like kind of give off by the way they're interacting with each other and the things that they say about the place where they are. So I think like I'm taking everything in and I'm listening to everything that people are saying, and I listen to what people don't say too. It's all there. It's all there.
You both touched on like just being there, and I think that's another thing we haven't said, which is how does the building itself impact the learning too? And in the variations, we have this huge array or variety, I should say, in buildings and how they're laid out, and classroom sizes, and you know, open concept, you know, classrooms, and how does that impact the learning too that you can't get unless you're actually there?
And especially when we're doing the feasibility study, like, you know, I know it was on the agenda, and I kind of, you know, made notes earlier thinking about it on that point. Crisafully, which I had never toured before this year, really stood out to me in the amount of light, the natural light, and the way the classrooms are set up. I loved the use of the flexible seating, and half the kids were like sat up on top of the bookcases. Sorry to maintenance people if you're really frustrated at not minding it, but the kids are literally right by this natural light, you know, working away on whatever, I think it was math that day. And you know, we know it's so good for mental health. I know as a teacher it's lovely to be in that environment, and it really does kind of create a really nice feeling as a learner. I mean, you're spending 6 hours of your day in there, and then you do go to some of our other buildings that just don't have that natural light, and you can kind of see that it's a different situation. So when it comes to something like the feasibility study, I think it definitely shows you how a classroom, you know, really should be functioning. And I have to say, Krista fully blew me away that day. I just loved seeing all the teachers and the way they were engaging the students, and definitely kind of the I think it was a very relaxed feeling about the building in terms of their learning, and there was definitely for me that lovely, you know, joy that we talk about. And there was one classroom where some of them were in this lovely teepee in the corner, and they were working away and there was some working with the teachers, and there was some standing at a desk, and it was just lovely to see everybody was learning in their own way. And I think Krista Fully for me really captured that kind of spirit. So yeah.
That was my
Sharon
school.
Kennelly for life.
That was my school.
Was that your school?
I remember laying on those little bookcases, actually. I know exactly what you're talking about. And then we'd make like the snowflakes and hang them up on the windows, because we had a lot of window space usually. But yeah.
So was my
No, actually what you said is exactly true. Yeah.
awesome.
Are there thoughts on when we look to do this next year? What might we try? Are there things we want to do differently? I know we had a harder time maybe getting 3 people on each tour, so that's one thing that we could think about is the number of walkthroughs or how we lay those out. I know we had talked about, and maybe
Yeah,
we're going to bring
so-
this up, some alternatives.
Well, so one point, not to be redundant, but something we originally talked about was my first reaction to all the dates was that they were kind of compressed.
Yeah.
And I felt like
Yeah.
maybe that works for the curriculum coordinators, and so I'm sure it wasn't, you know, whatever. I just thought it was harder to find flexibility in our schedules if it wasn't spread out over maybe a few more weeks to kind of like give time between.
Because it's a 2-hour time commitment,
Yeah.
and then there's transportation, and like for somebody who works during the day, that
Right.
was like.
Yeah, yeah.
I do
So-
think that there was an assumption that, if we're doing so many tours, we still want it to be in this short window for you,
Yes.
so that
right.
you can get it
Right.
done.
Right.
Right.
So I think you're
Yeah,
right.
so-
I feel
so
like,
that
I don't
feedback,
think
I
they
think,
had that. I
very
feel like
easy
if
to
the,
spread it out.
if the
Exactly,
committee
yeah.
wanted to spread it out, I think
Yeah.
they'd be able to do that.
And then I'm always thinking about like I mean the 2 hours. Sometimes you're like, oh, okay, that's like a lot of time. But to me, it goes by so fast. I mean, a lot of times we're in and out of, I don't know, 7 classrooms or so, like a bunch. And sometimes you're in a classroom for maybe 10 minutes or so. And sometimes I'd love to spend a little bit longer in some of them. I know one specific thought I had was at Blanchard when we did the STEM class. Was like, wouldn't it have been cool to have the supplies set up like on an extra table so that we could like come in.
Something up.
And
Yeah, basically.
no,
They were doing an
but it was
activity that day
it
with
was like a
buckets
hands-on
and-
STEM problem,
Yeah.
and they were these groups of students
If
were
you had to
solving it.
experience the same.
Right, and if it was like, okay, a school committee's gonna come in and they're gonna work at that table and try and solve the same, with the same constraints, and, I just thought that would be fun.
So you thought humiliation?
Yeah.
would be part of the
Yeah,
walk?
yeah.
Spot the engineer.
I felt the same way about archery at WA. I'm like, can I?
Or like, somebody, there was a math, was it math at Blanchard too, and they had like escape room things, and I was like, I was like, I
That's
wanna,
right.
like, give us a table, I wanna like sit down and start like going through one. But, and obviously you can't like, to the point of staging something, you can't set that up, for every class, but, when it makes sense, something like that would be kind of fun to get that interaction with the class.
I do think most teachers would be psyched if you were like, hey, can I try that too?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
they normally are like, oh, if you're here, they,
Yeah.
Right,
throw
right.
it to you too.
To that point, I mean, spending more time in each classroom, if you did the same number of classrooms, now we're talking a longer, and I don't think
Right, so-
making it longer than 2 hours makes sense, but
Doing less.
but doing less, yeah, like really doing a deeper dive and saying, we're gonna be really selective and intentional about the classrooms we go to. And by virtue of going to all these different schools, we'll have an opportunity to do see different things in different classrooms. Not every member necessarily, but in the aggregate, we'll see the things we wanna see. But I had the same sense at Stony Brook. I think in those language classes, I wanted to be there the whole class period. I was really, just really enjoying seeing what they were doing.
I
and
wanted to
didn't
say
want to get
film
up.
studies in WA.
Film studies at WA.
They were doing the Shawshank
I
Redemption.
did not want to leave that one. Yeah, that was so
That was
excellent.
amazing.
Yeah, Magna.
I also wanted to say, I don't know whether you guys do this during your visits, but I would highly encourage you guys to go visit the library and the DLT times, because what I'm hearing is you guys are looking at a lot of structured time for students, but I feel like also so many of the WA students spend a lot of unstructured time learning, whether that's how they choose to use it is a very interesting and insightful thing that I feel like could be helpful for you guys to look at. You'll see students sleeping, and honestly, maybe that's what they need sometimes. Sometimes they're working on something, sometimes they're reading, but you'll see all of that like taking place in the library, and I feel like that's where you'll get your one-on-one time. That's where you'll get to see what students are actually really focusing their time on, or what they're really using their time to do, because in class everyone's focused on one subject, but what are students doing outside of that environment when they aren't being forced to follow
That's a
the
great point.
And actually, following on from that, I also had noted the cafeteria. I was like, I'd love to go to lunch and in
Like we
across
have to-
all buildings
we have
and,
to order
and
it.
see how
Yep.
how that works too.
Yeah.
So I
That's
love
a-
that idea.
that's a great point.
Yeah.
Like student life.
Yeah, that speaks to like the like, I think what you're talking about is a little more like being a visitor in a building where you just like can walk around the building. whereas
Right.
We're very much escorted through the building,
Yeah.
so that's different.
Other thoughts? I know you had more, right?
Yeah, I did, sorry.
No,
How
please.
did you know? No. One thought I would say, when you asked, like, what do we look for? One thing that hits, that for me, not having an education background, something that I think really is a great example to me is at the elementary level, and they're piloting like a different way to teach spelling. So instead of like kind of, I'm going to use the wrong words, but like sort of memorization where like a list comes home, please chime in and correct me if I'm
you're
making
on
this up. But instead of like, as a parent, I know this year there's no list coming home from my child's classroom, but I don't actually know what's the alternative that's happening. So for me, that's really interesting to be able to kind of, the privilege of my role of being able to see what's happening at that grade level. and that stuff. And we had a really good conversation at Abbott about at what point do those kind of conversations come to something like this, to have that communication with parents. And we talked about how, like a couple of years ago, everyday math was a bigger community conversation, but that's been maybe 8 years or so. But you have like a new wave of parents that are coming through going like, I don't really know how to help you with this math problem because I may have got there a different way than you're being taught a different way, right? So it was just a really good conversation about like how to broaden what I think of as a great silver lining of my role, to be able to see that as a parent, and then thinking about how to broaden that communication to the community. And obviously, like the spelling pilot may not be a great example because we want staff to feel settled in something before we're, sort of announcing or opening it up for magnifying glasses or questions and stuff like that. But it was a great conversation about like, at what point do we just elevate some of that sharing.
But even those pilots are really important for us to see as school committee members, because I know like the K2 in particular is really going through that whole kind of science of reading transition right now. And, we vote on the budget and, if Kerry or Chris or Magali are coming to us saying, we need to fund this particular program or this, addition to the curriculum, that we can understand, having seen it kind of in the classroom, okay, we get it.
Right.
For making those decisions. And I mean, that's part of being a school committee member, is being, responsible in our, doing our due diligence.
Yeah.
So I think there's really value. Plus, you learned all about the science of
did.
reading down in the
did.
Cape, so.
My other takeaway that I just wanted to share too was in the last year and this year is really just getting to know those staff members, right? Like, I mean, at the high school level, the curriculum coordinators do teach a class, but at the elementary level, sometimes it's hard to get that visibility into that level of staff, right? And so we get to build that connection with them and have those conversations, which I think is so valuable that I wouldn't want to lose that, even if we continue to sort of evolve this in a different way.
Yeah.
And it even had me thinking sort of like what other staff don't we interact with that we could kind of get that that learning and that lens from. And like sometimes the curriculum coordinator tour stops by the intervention rooms. But like that would be another thing that, for instance, I don't have sort of lived experience with, that I would love to know a little bit more about, or even like a tour with sort of a special education lens and seeing, here's the things that are happening in the building at this slice of time with that lens in mind, and obviously not losing sight of kind of a facilities lens. And so to me, it's like we could have a whole number of different flavors of tours that check all these boxes that
Is
don't
there any
have to
office space at the schools for us that we could just live? I think that's what Valerie's calling.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, it's a really good point. I mean, it makes you just keep thinking of like all the valuable
Right.
things that we can
Oh,
learn in any number
I'm
of
sorry.
ways. No, go.
Yes, no, the other example I was thinking of was, and I know I had mentioned this, was the ELL teacher, or any teacher that travels, right? Because especially something that comes to us through the budget, we make these decisions based on what centralizing resources means, but we don't know what that looks like in practice to do that every day. So I would be open to any and all sort of visibility we get into that as we make the decisions at this table.
Are you open to multiple tours a year?
Oh, I think that's what we're hearing.
I think that's what you're meaning, because that would take us, if we had a different theme each year, that would take us a number of years. Whereas if we just did actually
Well-
provide different opportunities throughout the
And they
year
could be
to.
shorter. They could be
Yeah.
targeted, right?
Yeah.
They could.
Doesn't have to be every building.
Don't
Right,
have to be
exactly.
everybody,
So
right.
like the curriculum ones could be like one per grade level.
Yeah.
Or, or this one has that, it doesn't have to be like all 9 are for curriculum and then all 9 are facilities and all 9 are this.
That's right. Right.
That's helpful
a good idea.
feedback. So we'll, as we begin to structure the next round, whether it be later this year or fall of next year, then we'll definitely take this into account and share some suggestions, and then you can kind of tweak it so it meets your needs.
Awesome, thank
We
you.
had something come up at our Miller tour, and we had an opportunity to talk to, were they reading interventionists or specialists?
Literacy specialists.
Literacy specialists, yeah, that's right. who didn't happen to not have students at that moment. We had a really good conversation with them, and we really valued that, I think. And then at the same time, we had at least one classroom teacher say, I want to go on the tour because I want to see the other classrooms in action. And so then there was this excitement around, like, maybe could the curriculum coordinators cover a classroom and let some teachers go and walk around with us? And I think especially at the elementary level, like, there was,
Well,
there was some, sense behind that.
That's been the idea behind having the principals tour all the buildings.
Yeah.
So the principals, we move all of our principal meetings to each building, so the principals are touring each building, because when they've experienced, and the thing that we started talking about immediately was just for them to understand the benefit of teachers being able to visit other classrooms in their own building or even in other buildings. Because we know that it's valuable, it's just then, having a system set up that provides that opportunity for it, and there's also, you have to make sure that you've provided, or that you've established, a safe space for this too, because it's also easy for somebody if somebody else is coming into their space who's their colleague, if you haven't sort of established what the purpose is, I think it's easy for people to get defensive.
Yep.
And so you want to make sure that everybody understands that that's not the purpose. It's literally just the ability for everybody to share ideas so that people can see things that are successful in other places and how that can inspire them.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think, could I share one other thing that really resonated with me, and a big chunk of my time for both WA and Blanchard was actually spent with Brian O'Rourke, and I loved that I was able to dive in with him in two different spaces about kind of the health and wellness aspect of the classes. And really my big takeaway, and we saw some amazing classes from, sixth grade kind of emotional health classes right up to, there was an incredible senior class who were kind of doing presentations on some really, deep and mature subject areas. But my big takeaway I came with that from talking to Brian was just really realizing how crucial actually our health class is in kind of an avenue for really doing some explicit social emotional work with our learners. And so I think Brian was delighted to hear me say that. But honestly, I kind of think that sometimes we can be dismissive. I don't know if the students feel that too. It's like, oh, it's health. But when you see the work that is going on in those classes, I mean, I'd make it mandatory that it's a year-long class the whole way up, because I think it's a really valuable time that's carved out that can do some really positive work and support all the students in really important areas. So I have to say a big kudos to Brian. I know he comes up here the whole time and he does amazing work with Panorama, but I had some amazing conversations with him across the two buildings, so I really appreciated that, getting that time.
So today I was in a meeting where they're going to refile the piece of legislation around mental health requirement for mental health education. I don't know if folks know that there was a bill that was filed I think the first time was 2 years ago, on requiring there to be mandatory mental health education, like along with physical education. Yeah. It didn't pass in the big omnibus bill that passed this year on kids' mental health, but they're going to refile it. So it's just something to think about if what you're talking about is something of interest, because it could, I don't know if it's going to pass. I mean, they just did the big omnibus, but it's just something to have on folks' radar that there eventually might be a requirement for mental health education along with physical education. And the campaign that's refiling it is talking about the fact that it's actually come from the students. So it's the student activists who have been asking for this. And so that's why the campaign is thinking about refiling it, is because it's one of the pieces of legislation that actually comes from the students who said that they wanted that.
That's amazing.
That was actually a theme at the state conference too, was how to think about sort of the overloaded, the lack of capacity for clinicians maybe and for getting appointments, and then thinking about classrooms and schools as a different delivery model for some of that same content.
Kind of like essentially saying schools were kind of like the first front line for that kind of support and mental health and support, so yeah.
That's kind of hard though, because that is also a specialized job, and while folks are doing the job of the classroom, it's really hard to also task them with like being a therapist. And I think that while some of that is really great and that there should be therapeutic elements to like the passive classrooms, it's also a lot to ask, especially when people are dealing with their own stuff. I think that what I'm hoping is happening is that there will be more investment in bringing more therapists online, and really, there's a lot of reasons why that's not happening right now.
I think the spirit of what they were saying though at the conference also was not that we need to, as educators now, become mental health experts, but maybe that there is also more awareness for really cluing in when we feel like, okay, these students really need the next level.
Or also making sure that our practices in the classrooms aren't adding to whatever students are dealing with. I mean, the whole idea is to prevent you from needing to have acute, like, clinical care. And so what are we doing as, parents and educators that can help prevent that? But obviously you can't always prevent that. But
I think some of it, but that's like, there's been a lot of trauma from the pandemic, and there's been a lot of mental health concerns and anxiety and stress from that, and I think that that ship has sailed, and so now it's about like thinking about how to address some of the mental health concerns that we're seeing. I mean, I don't know, I just don't, I said what I said, I don't have to say it.
Any other thoughts on the walkthroughs, what we might do next year? Okay, this was a really good conversation. Thank you, both of you, and everyone in the curriculum coordinators for helping us get into the schools and really giving us that lens into what's happening in the classrooms. It's been really, really good this year. And we have 2 more, and we look forward to seeing what we do in the future.
Great.
And that's the end of the agenda items, folks. That can only mean one thing. That
Motion to adjourn to executive session to review executive session minutes dated 11/7/2022 and discuss strategy with respect to units A, C, E, and AFSCME collective bargaining. As an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining position, the committee will not return to public session.
Second.
Okay, all in favor of adjourning to executive session? Roll call vote, sorry. Mari?
Aye.
Catherine?
Aye.
Valerie?
Aye.
Aye. Gloria?
Aye.
Sean?
Aye.
We're adjourned.